Hello, I am a woman working as a cook. I got married this year and am thoroughly enjoying my life as a newlywed. I don't usually talk about my past with people around me. I don't have many friends, and unless someone is very close to me, I typically say that I grew up in an ordinary way. However, my childhood wasn't that peaceful. It wasn't because I was unhappy. I had someone who loved me very much. That person was my grandfather. He was my only family, and I remember always being with him. He protected me with his love, as I didn't have my parents. I was an orphan, you could say. My grandfather worked as a laborer on construction sites to support us. He would collect old paper to sell or pick fruits and vegetables to load onto trucks and sell as well. Because of this, I don't have any baby photos. My grandfather used to say that I should cherish my childhood, and after I turned 6, he would take me to a photo studio every year on my birthday to get a picture taken. It was like documenting my growth. Thus, I have some photos from each year. I didn't attend kindergarten, but I learned the alphabet and numbers. Although my grandfather was poor, he had a good reputation in our neighborhood. Neighbors would volunteer to take care of me, acknowledging my grandfather's hard work in raising me. Because of them, I could eat hot meals and play with the older children in the neighborhood, from whom I learned many things. When my grandfather came home from work, he would come to pick me up. The place where my grandfather and I lived was old and small, with a bathroom, a kitchen, and a bedroom. In winter, it was cold, and in summer, it was hot. However, it wasn't too uncomfortable for the two of us. In the summer, my grandfather fixed a fan he had found at a junkyard, and in the winter, he would collect used blankets and warm sheets, wash them thoroughly, and cover me with them. He did his best to provide for me, even though we didn't have much. Everyone in our neighborhood was in a similar situation, so we received a lot of help from our neighbors. They would come to pick me up from school on my first day of elementary school, and they took turns doing so on school days at my grandfather's request. When we had school excursions, the neighbors would even prepare food for my picnic basket as a gesture of their gratitude. My grandfather, in turn, would fix household appliances that had broken down, as he was very skilled. People helped each other with their respective skills. It was a friendly neighborhood where everyone got along well, although we were not exempt from gossip. People were probably curious about why my grandfather was raising me under such difficult circumstances. My grandfather never talked to me about my parents as I was growing up. Whenever I asked where my parents were, he would simply say that they had gone to heaven shortly after I was born. So, I assumed that was the case. During my early years in elementary school, I thought my parents might have had some incurable illness, like cancer. They had passed away due to illness. However, when I was in the later years of elementary school, I started hearing different stories. The sources were mainly the neighbors. I'm not sure, but I don't think my grandfather ever got married. He's an old man from this area, but no one ever heard about his wife. Maybe they didn't hear because she never existed. It was strange. My grandfather had clearly told me that my parents got sick and passed away, but the neighbors knew nothing about my parents. Additionally, it was confusing that they had never seen my grandmother either. According to a neighbor, for me to be born, my parents must have existed, which meant I needed a grandmother too. After hearing this, I realized that we didn't have any family photos of my parents, let alone a photo of my grandmother. My grandfather's house had only a small album with the photos he took of me once a year, and some taken by our neighbors of me and him. As I entered high school and started going through puberty, I became rebellious and began questioning my identity. Why was I living only with my grandfather? My curiosity about my parents grew stronger. When I was in 9th grade, I decided it was time to confront my grandfather. Please, tell me the truth, Grandpa. Where are my mother and father? Are they dead? Are they alive? Why are there no photos? Who is my grandmother? Why is there no photo of her? The neighbors say you've lived here for so long, but no one has seen my grandmother. Are you hiding something from me? I questioned him as if I were interrogating a criminal. I was so desperate that after becoming emotional, I started crying. My grandfather simply comforted me. Bianca, I'm sorry. One thing I can promise is that you are my granddaughter. No matter what others say, you are my granddaughter and the person I love the most. The truth is, your parents couldn't raise you. They left you at my doorstep and left. If they are alive, they might come back for you someday, he said. He showed me a small bracelet and said, This is what your mother and father left with you. I believe it was on you when you were born at the hospital." Seeing that, my curiosity diminished a bit. It was true that my parents had abandoned me, but I thought it was enough that my grandfather raised me with love. From that day, I managed to control myself and started to escape the whirlwind of adolescence. I had no intention of going to college. We were too poor for me to even consider it, and I didn't want to burden my grandfather any further. So, I decided on my career path before even entering high school. "Grandpa, I want to be a cook. I want to enroll in a culinary course when I'm in my senior year of high school and get my cooking license. After I graduate, I want to find a job immediately," I told my grandfather. He asked if I didn't want to go to college and said he would do whatever it took to pay for my education. I told him I wanted to be a cook and prepared the ground in advance so he wouldn't feel guilty about it. As planned, once I entered my senior year of high school, I started learning to cook through a vocational training program at school. I obtained various culinary licenses. I secured a job a month before graduation, and a week after graduating, I received my first paycheck. I bought steaks and headed home. I wanted to eat out, but I didn't have enough money for that, so I decided to be content with steaks at home. I bought some vegetables and lettuce. When I arrived home, my grandfather's eyes widened in surprise. I handed him my first paycheck in an envelope. "Grandpa, this is your money to spend. It's what's left after buying the steaks," I said. My grandfather couldn't speak. "Bianca, I can't accept this. This is money you earned with so much effort. You should spend it on yourself." "I can never accept this," he said and handed the envelope back to me. "Grandpa, if you don't accept it, I'll leave the house because only you do things for me. I really want to give you this money," I insisted. I threatened him, and finally, my grandfather cried as he accepted the envelope. He then placed the envelope in the book he was reading. It was very special to share a steak dinner in the place where I had lived my whole life. I felt proud to be able to do something for my grandfather for the first time in my life, and I was happy as we chatted animatedly. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. "Who could be coming at this hour?" my grandfather asked. I got up and opened the door. To my surprise, there were two police officers standing there. "Is Murillo here?" they asked. I said that he was my grandfather. "Are you Bianca?" the police asked. When I said that I was, they told us, "You both need to come with us to the police station." When I asked why, they responded, "Mr. Murillo is accused of kidnapping a child, so you both need to come with us." I was shocked. Kidnapping a child? I couldn't understand why my grandfather was being accused of such a terrible crime. I insisted that my grandfather was not that kind of person, but the police just repeated that we had to go with them. That night, my grandfather and I got into the police car together. When we arrived, we waited in a designated area. Strangely, my grandfather seemed very calm. After some time, the police returned with a few other people. Among them was a woman in her 50s and a couple holding hands. The woman shouted as she approached my grandfather and me, "That's him. He was the janitor. He took the president's daughter." "What are you talking about? Who did my grandfather kidnap?" I shouted at the woman. The police tried to calm both the woman and me down. The couple who had been standing behind the shouting woman approached me. "Are you Bianca?" the woman asked, tears filling her eyes. At that moment, I felt confused and uncomfortable, but I nodded. Suddenly, she hugged me tightly and began to cry loudly. "Bianca, I am your mother," she said, words I thought I would never hear. I was shocked and confused, but my grandfather's reaction puzzled me even more. He stood up calmly and said, "You finally came back. Now everything will be okay." The woman in her 50s shouted, "You had no relation to the child from our orphanage. What nonsense are you saying?" She insisted that my grandfather needed to be punished for kidnapping, and I screamed that my grandfather was innocent. The couple stood there looking confused. The woman in her 50s explained that a couple had come to her orphanage, saying they had left a baby in front of the institution and had come back to claim the child. They left a letter stating they would return for the child and included all the hospital documentation. The child was around 3 or 4 years old. However, there were no records of the child or any adoption papers. The woman recalled an incident from long ago when a child went missing, causing a great commotion. They reported it to the police and filed missing children reports, but they never found the child. She remembered an old man who had worked at the orphanage but suddenly quit. He used to stay close to the children, so she had considered firing him anyway, but he sensed it and quit. Could it be that he had taken a child from the orphanage? They conducted a DNA test while my grandfather calmly observed. He asked the police, "Are they really Bianca's parents?" The police said we had to wait for the DNA results. My grandfather then said, "Officer, if you think it is necessary for me to stay in prison, I will, but please listen to my story." He held the officer's hand and began to speak. The police confirmed that my grandfather was there to defend himself. He said he would talk once the DNA confirmed they were my parents. The police hesitated and asked the couple for their opinion. They agreed to wait for the DNA results if that was the only way to hear the old man's story. My grandfather remained at home under bail, and I stayed with him while going to work. 2 days later, the DNA test results came back, and they showed that the couple was indeed my parents with 99.999% certainty. Finally, after 20 years, I met my parents. When I heard the DNA results, I felt something strange. Without realizing it, tears were streaming down my face, and my parents hugged me tightly, crying loudly. The woman who was the orphanage director glared at my grandfather and shouted as if ready to kill him, "Now you need to arrest this old man. You tried to ruin my business." She was acting frantic and agitated. My grandfather began to tell his story, as promised. He took out many papers from home and started showing them to the police one by one. It's true that I worked as a janitor at the orphanage. It's not far from where I live now. One day, I went to work early in the morning and found a child sleeping in front of the orphanage, curled up and shivering. I assumed she was abandoned by her parents. I was worried she might be cold, so I started to carry her inside the orphanage, but she woke up, blinking her big, black eyes and calling me Grandpa. The child handed me her bag, and inside it, there was a doll along with these papers and a letter saying they would come back to get their daughter. I took the child into the orphanage, and that's how she started living there. While doing my cleaning job, I often saw the child, but she usually had a sad expression. I wondered why, and after about a month, I discovered the reason. That woman, he pointed to the director, was mistreating her, especially targeting her. At that time, the orphanage was struggling financially due to the large number of children, and another child had just arrived. She took out her anger on the child, forcing her to wash clothes outside and do the dishes. Her little hands were red, frozen, and bleeding. I went to the director's office several times and asked her to stop treating the child that way, but she simply fired me. As I was leaving, I felt so bad for the child, who looked so unhappy. "That's why I did what I did," my grandfather confessed. Even then, I had her bag with those papers inside. The director didn't bother to read the documents in the bag and neglected to register her, while also being abusive. This is why I took her and started raising her as my granddaughter. I knew it was wrong, but I had no other choice. After he finished speaking, the police were in a dilemma, just like I was. Only the director seemed triumphant, saying, "What nonsense is this old man spouting? You're making up a story to destroy me. I'll sue you for defamation." She continued her rant. The police asked my grandfather if he had any evidence to support his claim. My grandfather stood up confidently and said that a woman who worked there at the time, named Mrs. Lara, was a witness. The police immediately went to speak with Mrs. Lara. While we waited, I couldn't say anything. The truth was finally coming to light. That afternoon, Mrs. Lara came to the police station to testify. She had taken photos of my red, frozen hands and had kept them all these years. When my mother saw my red, frozen hands, she began to cry. There were other photos showing me being abused by the director, with a cut on my chin. With this undeniable evidence, the director was cornered, and my parents immediately said they would press charges. Only then did she start begging for forgiveness, but it was too late. She had used violence against children and was arrested. My grandfather and I were able to return home that night. I finally heard my parents' side of the story. My father had been deceived in a business deal, which left them penniless and living on the streets. Unable to care for me, they left me at the orphanage. They worked hard to rebuild their lives, and as soon as they had some money, they went back to the orphanage. But by then, I was gone and not even registered. Recently, When they returned to the orphanage, the director suggested that perhaps the janitor had taken a child. This prompted them to report it to the police. The director's attempt to blame everything on my grandfather actually helped my parents find me. Although what she did was unforgivable, my parents explained that it had only been a few years since their finances had stabilized. They worked with the guilt of having abandoned their daughter, but now they felt they could finally ease some of that burden. I held no grudge against my parents. I was just overjoyed and eager to finally meet them. I didn't blame my grandfather either. He had saved me and given me immense love and care. I believe that's why I didn't harbor any resentment toward my parents. I told them I understood their situation and thanked them for coming back to find me. My mother hugged me, crying, and then knelt in front of my grandfather, saying, "If it weren't for you, she wouldn't have grown up as well as she has." They expressed their gratitude and said they wanted to take care of him from now on and live together as a family. My grandfather initially refused several times, but my parents were relentless. Eventually, my grandfather and I moved to my parents' home. However, the adjustment wasn't easy since we had lived apart for so long. In the end, my parents found another house right next to theirs for my grandfather and me. Only then could we live comfortably, as we were used to. After work, the whole family would gather for dinner and watch TV, just like any other family. After I got married, my parents joined my grandfather to live together. Now, we all became a family without feeling uncomfortable. The director of the orphanage was prosecuted by my parents, who were determined not to forgive her. I had to go to court for the case, and during that time, I met my husband. He was working under the prosecutor handling the case against the orphanage director. He became not only my husband, but also my friend who knows everything about my past. He said he deeply respected my grandfather. I often think about it and wonder if I could have done what my grandfather did. I don't know if I would have managed the same way. It would have been so difficult. I love and respect my grandfather more than anyone else in this world. I hope he lives a long life in good health.